Making Rainbow Waves, a podcast by ILGA World. Welcome everybody to Making Rainbow Waves, a podcast by ILGA World telling the stories and raising the voices of LGBTI human rights defenders worldwide. My name is Daniele Paletta, and in this episode we're going to talk about Pride. We have a very special guest, Julian Sanjivan, who is the co-president of InterPride, the global organization that brings together pride organizations from around the world, as well as regional, national, and local pride networks. We came together to talk about their personal story, how the pride movement has made it through the COVID-19 pandemic, and so much more. Here's what they told us. I first wanted to start by asking about your personal story and how did you get into activism for LGBTI rights and into the Pride movement?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually born in Malaysia. I grew up in Malaysia. I've been in the United States now for, come August will be exactly 9 years. I got my asylum granted here in the United States. Back in Malaysia, I started my career doing a lot of events, training programs, etc. And, I even started up my own company focusing on corporations and all of that. I got into advertising, but at some point in my life, I realized, this is not what I really want to do. I really want to be able to give back to the community. And as I started accepting myself more, but I think, being in a country like Malaysia, it was very difficult. We don't have the type of legal environments that just really allows us to be, up and about screaming proudly that we're gay, it's just a very dangerous environment to be really out and open. So knowing that, being part of the community, and I felt like, that's where my passion lies. I started volunteering. Started volunteering with a nonprofit called the PT Foundation. It's one of the biggest nonprofits in Malaysia dealing with HIV and AIDS. And they also work with a lot of the community on gender, sexuality, issues around HIV and AIDS is the priority. And so by volunteering, conducting training sessions, I realized it's really what I was passionate about. So I gave up my corporate job, got into nonprofit world. I became the HR director, and eventually, I was there for a few years. But through that experience, I realized the challenges that we had to deal with the authorities, with the government. There were some really scary moments that we'd actually experience. I personally experienced too. I think at that point when I really wanted to start doing activism more actively, I started noticing violations that the community that we were serving. And so given the work that we were doing, I realized how much of a problem and challenge they faced with authorities. For example, if they were sex workers and if they were transgender and also doing sex work, the experience with the authorities was really awful. So I started noticing a lot of this kind of violation. And so to me, it was very frustrating, even though I was doing HR, but, I started doing a lot of programmatic stuff and I started getting into advocacy and all of that and started getting meetings together with the local police authorities to bring awareness and how can we address this. So a lot of those things. So yeah, I think that's when it really started. And moving to the United States, I just started focusing a lot more on issues pertaining to the community. And being an immigrant myself and having won my asylum, so I'm really passionate about working for the community, issues that affect the community as well. And of course, being a person of color myself and non-binary, those are also issues that are very personal to my heart.
Oh, it's very, very good to hear all of this, and thanks for sharing your story with us. And how did you come to InterPride, and can you tell us a little bit more about what InterPride is and does?
InterPride is actually it's pretty much an umbrella organization for pride organizers around the world, right? And thus the name InterPride, it's international pride, and we represent about 400 members from about 70 countries from around the world, and Of course, we, through our Pride Radar initiative, where we try to identify where the prides are around the globe, we recognize, there are anywhere between 1,200 to 1,500 Pride organizations around the world. And Pride looks very different, right? And so even though we may have 400 active organizations who are members, but we're technically representing all of these Pride organizations. And so InterPride, really, our focus is bringing Pride organizations together, networking, education, support, sending in solidarity, advocating for issues that's affecting the community that we serve. So these are some of the core areas that we really focus on, and that's what we do. We are almost 100% volunteer run. We used to be for many, many years. We recently brought in part-time help just 2 weeks ago because, the growth that we've been seeing. But, we're pretty much still a volunteer-run organization and spread out throughout the organization, throughout the world. Our leadership team is, from all of the different continents, various countries, very diverse team. And so we're really proud of that. But, of course, there's always room for improvement, but we represent a global audience. And so through some of the work that we've done, some of the work that we are doing and have done in the past include World Pride. World Pride is our signature event. We own the brand. We license it to different cities. So this year it's going to be in Copenhagen in 2021. And Copenhagen is focusing a lot on human rights as well in their event. And then 2023 is in Sydney, Australia. We're really proud that this is the first time it's going to a country in the Southern Hemisphere, which we have never really hosted before. And so there are, bidders for future hosts. And then we have Global Pride. We hosted Global Pride for the first time last year. There was an opportunity to bring folks together from around the world on a virtual platform when the pandemic happened. It affected a lot of us in the community quite significantly. Pride is an opportunity for us to come forward, come together. For a lot of people, it's when they come out, and that was taken away, right, with the pandemic. And it's also important to understand the members that we serve are not just big names like New York City Pride, Sydney, Mardi Gras, or, Paris and London. No, there are so many of them that are really small Pride organizations in small towns, in regions that some of us may not even have heard of, and, they could look very different, right? They could be a picnic or a cycling event, and depending on where you are in the world, Pride looks different because of culture and law, So Global Pride really brought all of these people together virtually, hundreds of different entries, over nearly 60 million viewers. So that's something that we did. And we raised a lot of money and we gave back to a lot of the Pride organizers, because essentially people need to understand that Pride organizers, even though they're an organization, but they represent an entire community that they're serving, right? A lot of our members are organizations that are one-stop centers. They provide multiple services, and Pride celebrations are just one of them. ROPE, which is a Racism and Oppression Awareness Program, is something that we introduced last year to really talk about racism and oppression. That's a major issue that's been around for centuries, but really it's with the George Floyd incident, the death of George Floyd, and how that brought about the Black Lives Movement was a lot more visible around the world, not just in the United States. And so racism and oppression became a major discussion around the world. And that's something that we wanted to embark on to educate our members, support, and, share resources. So these are just examples. There are many more, like the Solidarity Fund, which we created to support folks around the world. And so these are things that InterPride does, and that's what InterPride is about.
Starting from 2020, the whole world has been battling with the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Many were left struggling to survive in a world that has become even more unequal and violent. LGBTI communities were left particularly vulnerable. And in many places where laws were already a cause of inequality, things have only got worse. We asked Julian how Pride organizers have made it through 2020, and what is the situation for the Pride movement at the moment.
I think 2020 was a disaster for all of us, right? I mean, it just happened so quickly, and everyone around the world was just, was just taken by surprise, and it really affected us significantly in 2020. And it was so close to Pride season two, and I think for a lot of people that uncertainty was, people were starting off with, okay, we're gonna have we're gonna have a march, we're gonna have this Pride festival, we're gonna have concerts, and then all of that stuff. And then everything had to change. Some people had already signed up sponsors, signed up vendors, secured locations, and brought, planning to bring in temporary staff members. Everything had to change overnight. At first, I think people like, what do we do? How do we go about it? Yeah. And then questions around, so what do we do then? We cannot just not do anything. Pride still needs to happen. And so there's a lot of conversation around exploring virtual components started, right? I think it is a very, very quickly, there's the progression. And I must say, Pride organizers, generally, we are a very resilient bunch. I think, generally the LGBTQIA population, we just have to be resilient given how difficult, situation that we're in, the discrimination and all of the struggles that we face. We're just naturally resilient and strong. So we just came up, we had to come up with solutions and figure out and keep, moving on that way. It didn't mean that it didn't impact us. I think there's a lot of, emotional, psychological impact on so many different levels. The trauma of it all, just knowing that things are happening so quickly, you're losing a lot of stuff very quickly, whether it's employees, the possibility of not knowing whether your organization will be around anymore, not being able to come together, meet people, especially for the queer community at large, the LGBTQIA plus community. We rely a lot on our chosen families, right? And not being able to interact with each other was significant. Now, a little bit more than a year in 2021, for many of us in certain parts of the world, there's hope. For the first time with the introduction of vaccinations and the effectiveness of other like testing and social distancing and all of that is we're seeing results, especially through vaccination. But also it's important to keep in mind that some of us are more privileged. And so I think for Pride organizers, looking at all of this, there's hope. We know we can start planning, and the one thing I feel that strongly 2020 has impacted is how can we make our events more accessible for folks who have never really had the opportunity to be actually part of the celebrations, because with doing it virtual, you've literally opened up our events to the whole world. Folks from the Middle East, folks from parts of Africa, South America, Asia, Eastern Europe, people who don't really get to do a lot of this are suddenly, visible and able to see this, and they're also able to share and organize their own. And so, that impact is so significant. And that's something that people want to try and do more and still keep doing. And that's something that I feel is really important, a lesson that we all have, or at least something precious, the silver lining, if I may say, from the pandemic that we've come out of. And so, a lot of folks are looking at hybrid events. That's becoming a major discussion, and that's good. That's really, really good because it makes us more accessible, like I said earlier. But at the same time, the reality of it is many of our LGBTQIA family around the world don't have the same privilege. For them, they're still thinking about safety and their health. So I think it's important for us to also think about, that for a second, and what can we do, to support. Another trend that I'm also noticing is a lot of the Pride organizers, and so they are looking at, okay, let's give a little bit more time. Let's plan to do our virtual in-person events later this year. So we're starting to see a significant increase of numbers in terms of in-person events that are going to be happening in September, October, and November. Most events tend to happen around this time of the year, but a lot of events, in-person events, are moving towards the end because they still want to make sure that people understand we have a responsibility to make our events safe. Safety is a priority.
I see, and yeah, you mentioned Global Pride, and I can only imagine how great, but also stressful on the organizing side it must have been for all of you involved.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And yeah, I wanted to ask you if you have a memory of that. Like if you had to share like one memory of the day, what would that be?
I remember being very emotional,
Mhm.
and I'm trying so hard not to get emotional right now because it is a lot of work, right? And knowing how the pandemic had affected every one of us, and including myself, um, seeing all of the celebrations and people coming together online was just phenomenal. When it started, I remember watching and then crying because I was just so emotional seeing all of it come together. And then I went and slept for like a couple of hours, came back, and I was watching again, and I was crying again. It's not that it's just tears of joy and tears of just being overwhelmed and seeing all of this come together. So I remember that distinctively, but I also remember how just looking at how Pride is celebrated and representation, looking at folks from the Middle East, folks from Southeast Asia, folks from Africa, communities, putting the content out there. Being in the United States for for 9 years now, um, I'm used to seeing how Pride looks like here, for a while now. Um, but then when seeing that, I haven't had the privilege to traveling to many parts of the world, especially in the global south for Pride. I was in India last year, just before the pandemic, to celebrate Pride there in Mumbai. And it's a very interesting experience. It was my first time to India. I've never been there, and seeing just how the community was celebrating it was an eye-opening experience for me as well. So seeing all of that online, the dances, the representation, and the different way people were expressing it was so empowering, so empowering, and that's why I was overwhelmed. We did this, like we put this together in such a short period of time, with the entire world watching, almost 60 million people. It was a lot, and it's just it's a sense of achievement that I think it's important to recognize, because it was a community coming together to do this together.
One very important topic remained to be discussed in this conversation: the connections between the Pride movement and the broader human rights work. Here's what Julian told us. I have the feeling that sometimes, the very visible moment of Pride, like the marches and all the events, sometimes, like, kind of overshadow all the human rights work that the Pride movement does. Also in the eyes of our communities, and of course we know that that's not the case. So my question to you was, how do Pride and human rights work connect?
Both are not mutually exclusive. They're not. I mean, Pride is a human rights component. Like, when you think about it, the Stonewall Uprising, a year after the Stonewall Uprising, the first Pride marches happened here in New York City and many other cities around the country here in the United States. In parts of the world that's still used as a major landmark, like, even in Germany, for example, they still call it the CSD Day. And so it has had its impact. And that is human rights. Like, the fact that we rose up and we fought back because we were being oppressed. How can that not be, us advocating for our community? So that's why uh, I think we need to take a moment and recognize that this is part of the human rights work that we do. Going out there, organizing in an environment that you have so many different resistance is not easy. It's about visibility. It's about making people know we are here, we're queer, and we're proud. And that is a huge component of what human rights is about. The fact that in many parts of the world people can't even do that, and they want to do that, and they're arrested, or they're killed for even trying to do that. That human rights, that it's a human rights violation by itself. So the ability for us to speak up and have our voice heard in a platform like Pride is about human rights. End of the day, I don't think human right is just sitting in the United Nations and, having your voice heard. And, it's not just about making legislative change. Yes, don't get me wrong. All of this are very important. It has to happen. But they all work together. We all work together. We all come together and we do our parts. We are trying to do more. We are hoping that in the years to come, we will have more formal representation in specific decision-making organization in a global level that can bring, can really uplift the community a lot more, have more of a voice. But in the meantime, we are still going to do what we do, bringing pride organizations together and keep uplifting them so that they in turn can do what they're doing in terms of human rights, which is letting people organize pride for the community, because it's what brings us together. Whether you're protesting, whether you're celebrating, pride is how you choose to express.
I think all of this and all of the work that you Pride organizers do deserves the recognition, because it really brings all the community together. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much, Julian, for being here with us today and for all the conversation. And I hope we will continue to be working together for our communities.
Thank you so much for having me, Danielle. This is amazing. And I enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you
for all of the work that you do as well for ILGA. And y'all are doing such an amazing work. I must say, like, even my presentation that I did, and I do regularly talk to people, I use a lot of information from ILGA. So thank you for the work that y'all do.
Thank you so much. Making Rainbow Waves is a podcast by ILGA World. This episode was hosted by Daniele Paletta and edited by Naslu Mayuk. You can find every episode on all streaming platforms or on ilga.org. Thanks for listening.